Thanks for being on the podcast, Ray.
Oh, it's a privilege.
I appreciate it. So I actually want to jump in just right off the bat here on the listener question. And this is something that popped up actually from a few people. But the idea is, how should we think about, as believers, taking care of ourself or self-care versus selflessness? And we were chatting just a little bit about this before the podcast, but we hear the phrase that we are the average of the 5 people that we spend the most time with. Mm-hmm. And I think that it probably comes from a place of well-meaning, and yet I've actually had this conversation with a few people already. That seems to be somewhat in contradiction with the biblical teaching on selflessness. And yet, also, Jesus did spend more time with his disciples. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. As believers, how should we think about that self-care versus selflessness? And is it okay to have boundaries sometimes in areas where people are sort of a constant drain or or distinctively like negative, having a distinctly negative impact? How should we think about that?
This is one of those areas where it's not as though there's just one right answer. We can't be formulaic and simplistic. There are 2 ways to navigate work versus rejuvenation. Mm-hmm. Some people work in order to play. Mm-hmm. I think Christians play in order to work. So our goal is not the weekend. Mm-hmm. In fact, the very category, the weekend, is not in Scripture. When we think of the weekend, we turn Sunday into a second Saturday. It's one more day to go to Home Depot and so forth. But our rhythm is to embrace the challenge of life and work hard, work joyfully, work fruitfully for those 5 or 6 days, and then deeply rest to be renewed in order to work again.
Yes.
So I love vacation and so forth, but that's not the goal. Christians rightly think of heaven as our rest. And when our goal, Kent, our goal in life is not to end up ever youthful, ever fresh. Our goal is we want to play the game till the end of the 4th quarter and crawl off the field exhausted, having won.
Yes.
That's very satisfying. So we play. Mm-hmm. We do play in order to work. Mm-hmm. And because the larger category still is stewardship. And we perceive our lives with wonder as a stewardship from God above. We see his grace and glory just sort of aglow everywhere we look in our lives. And when we're dealing with high-maintenance people who require a lot of attention, they are draining. We have to put it in the category stewardship, or else we'll go crazy.
Okay. And so when we would put that in the category of stewardship, we would be saying we are stewarding our relationships that we have, and they're part of the relationships that we have to sort of glorify Christ. Is that how you look at that? And if those relationships are in the stewardship category?
Yeah, if God is the one who's giving me my life in its totality and moment by moment, then I answer to God for what I do with it. So I don't answer to the people whose expectations and demands are coming my way. I respect that. I want to be as helpful as I can, but I answer to God, even if they think I answer to them. Still, I know I answer to God. So all of us are navigating those very awkward relationships and moments with a mixture of both kindness and refusals. And one of the tricks in life is to disappoint people at a rate they can absorb.
I've heard you say that before. How are you doing with that?
The longer I live, I'm actually beginning to learn a little something about it.
So would you say then that in the case of a relationship that seems to weigh on you, you don't want to run from that too quickly? Mm-hmm. That relationship is there for a reason. You may maybe benefit them, and they may benefit you in some ways that you wouldn't think about or see. There is a time when you may need to remove yourself or have some boundaries, but we don't want to do that too quickly. Is that how you would think about that?
Yeah. Everything in life is ultimately sent to us from God, including the interruptions, the frustrations, and the exasperating people. Remember C.S. Lewis, when he was fighting World War I, he got close to a fellow soldier, and they made a pact together that if one of them died in the war, the other would care for the family of the fallen soldier. And this other guy died. And so C.S. Lewis he was faithful to that commitment and took this man's mother into his home as his own mother for the rest of her life. And she was kind of a pain in the neck. So here was C.S. Lewis working on these brilliant books that benefit us to this day. But when he went from his study to the kitchen, for example, there was a good chance that she would interrupt him and require something from him on the way. And we think, what a waste of time. Come on, this is C.S. Lewis.
Yes.
But at some level, that was a gift to him from God. Mm-hmm. Now, he kept writing his books, but he accepted this kind of annoyance, this very demanding presence in his home as a Christian responsibility that I have to believe somehow made his books better.
Yes. That's a really great example, actually, because it would be naturally, we would be quick to come to the conclusion, hey, C.S. Lewis is kind of important. He's writing really good books. We should remove all distractions. Yeah. And yet he didn't remove that distraction. Yeah. So that is a great example. What do you think about the idea of just this quote, you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with? What do you think about the idea of trying to be around people that are further along in the direction that you're heading? Mm-hmm. Is it okay to seek that out, or does that border on, well, let me just leave the question at that. Is that okay to seek that out?
There's a kind of self-evident, commonsensical wisdom about that, but at the same time, I don't trust it.
Okay.
Because I would be, just personally, I would probably be seduced by that, and I would want to build my world with people who I might tell myself are helping me to be a better whatever, but really I'm building this sort of self-invented, self-flattering, too convenient world. The person I really need to hang out with is God. I want to be not the average of those I hang out with. I want to be more like him. So it doesn't strike me as a Christian aspiration. Mm-hmm. There's a certain commonsensical obviousness about it, but it would need to be qualified by a Christian.
Yes. Okay, so that is very helpful because I've had this discussion with a few of my friends in the last couple of years, and it seems to me that it is something that a few years ago we were sort of just, oh, that makes sense, let's go there. And then as we got older, it sort of seemed, I don't know if this is even biblical. And in some cases, it seems really shallow and sort of self-serving. Mm-hmm. And so there's one guy in particular I remember having this discussion with about 2 years ago, but pretty in depth. And so, yes, I think, and actually that is not something that we had thought about in that discussion, is our goal is not necessarily to become like other people around us. We were to become more like Christ, and maybe that's where that falls apart. I also wanted to ask about using reason or logic and how we should think about reason and logic in relationship with faith. And it seems to me, and this could be an incorrect perception, but it sort of seems to me, just based on my understanding, that you have this scale, and the more reason and logic you use, the less faith, and the more faith you use, the less reason and logic. I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. That is a fallacious characterization of the relationship between faith and reason. Christian faith is set apart by its satisfying reasonableness. You could look at the whole Bible and say, really, the Bible is an appeal to human thought, reason, reflection. God does not deal drugs. He doesn't pass out, it's characteristic of my generation, LSD, and so that we all take trips. God invites us to sit down and open up this fairly difficult book and start reading and thinking. And God says, and the Bible itself says, faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of Christ. So the word of Christ, the discourse of Christ, the reason of Christ elicits and evokes and builds faith. So these are interwoven, not competing. There are basically two ways for us to know anything. There is the inductive method, which is a matter of assembling evidences, putting together conclusions from those evidences, writing down the conclusion as a provisional and somewhat tentative assertion, but then you've got to stay open because more evidences are coming in, more research is being done, more data are always arriving. So using the inductive method, and that is a valid form of knowing, it really helps the world go round. It helps human society, human functioning, but it can never arrive at finality. In fact, people using the inductive method ought not to arrive at finality. Then they would be closed-minded. The other way to know something is by faith, which does not invalidate scientific research, inductive fact-gathering, reason, ordinary cognition. But God enters into faith in a way God doesn't enter into the inductive method. God enters into faith to bring finality and certainty. There are many areas of life where the inductive method is quite sufficient. It really works. It's supposed to work. But in the ultimate issues of life, for example, how should I get ready for death? Every person on the human race, has to consider that. And the inductive method will not get us ready for something as final as death. So God comes to us in mercy and in grace through the gospel and awakens with us the gift. He gives us the gift of certainty, where we enter into an awareness, a consciousness, an assurance that we have actually landed somewhere that cannot be invalidated. It cannot unravel. And that faith cracks our hearts open to that experience of assurance. The inductive method keeps us thinking, keeps us open. We can never really land, and we're not supposed to. So there are these two basic ways of knowing that the human being benefits from.
So are there certain categories of decisions or certain categories of certainty that make more sense? I hate to say it, I'll just say what I'm thinking.
Sure.
That make more sense to use faith in? Like the end of life is a really great example. How how about the decision to start another product line, and that decision is happening tomorrow?
Right. Yeah.
Are those two different very types of decisions?
I think they are.
Okay.
Yeah. Because God has not promised guidance and assurance about a new product line.
Mm-hmm.
We have to figure it out.
Yes.
But God has promised guidance and assurance about the ultimate issues of life that are going to matter forever.
Okay. This is is helpful. So the categories of decisions, I guess, is not something that I've been hearing a lot about. I was thinking more in terms of product line. Next week, we're going to decide if we're going to start one or not. And that decision, thinking, sort of taking a leap of faith, which is a common term, or running out the budgets and the numbers.
Right.
But maybe that's an incorrect way of thinking about that.
If we're thinking about a new product line or anything of that nature that's so provisional and temporary, valid, it really matters.
Mm-hmm.
But a bazillion years from today, I'm not going to be worried about it.
Mm-hmm.
Even in those things, however, Christians in business can be thinking, help me to be honest with myself. They can pray that. God cares about that. Not to give us the perfect answer, but help me be honest with myself. Help me to be honest with my colleagues. Help me to be thorough. Help me not to be lazy. Help me to be humble and not stubborn as I'm working with my colleagues. And the graces of Christianity lubricate the gears of life in this world. They certainly do. But when it comes to the finally demanding mysteries of life, we need God to come just tell us what's coming down. And then our hearts crack open. We just receive it by faith. God has spoken. We accept it.
Okay. So how should we think about the decisions that are in the categories of should we go to this school or that school, or should we start this product line or not? How should faith inform those decisions then, if at all?
Well, as you're speaking, Kent, I'm thinking of James chapter 1. If anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives without making us feel small. Really, all these considerations we're sharing together today, these are wisdom questions. These are judgment calls. And God cares about that too. And he does help us, but he doesn't guarantee that we'll come up with infallible conclusions.
Yes.
Such that if they fail, we can blame God.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. That is, it's very helpful. And it seems to me that some of us have been getting it wrong on this point, because you hear the term leap of faith, and sometimes even on very granular decisions. And so to state it in the affirmative, we're saying that on those types of decisions, granular decisions, it would be unwise to sit at a table and pray for 5 minutes and then just go ahead and pick an answer.
I would be cautious about that.
It would be wise to use logic and reason and run some
teamwork, data. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And then all the while praying, Lord, help me not to mess this up.
Yes. Yeah. I wanted to ask you, I warned you that we'd be jumping all around here. But on the way over, someone was texting me actually, and it was essentially a prayer request to not have a fear of man. And so that also kind of came into mind when it comes to logic and reason. There is a good way to get counsel and input and help from other people. And then sometimes there's also a people pleasing that is born out of sort of a fear of man. How would you decipher that ground?
Boy, that's a hard question for me. I don't trust or even know my own motivations. my heart is really complicated. And my heart incorrigibly lies to me about what's really going on inside. There's a fascinating book called, I think the title is The Vain Brain, in which the researcher, a psychologist, studied how our minds deceive us. And we go along with it. For example, it even came down to this. Our minds tend to prefer certain letters of the alphabet. The letters that our names are formed with, we tend to prefer to other letters. We just have positive feelings about those letters. And less, So, I mean, my name is Ortlund, a Swedish name. I mean, think about the letter O. That's an amazing letter.
It is, yeah.
I mean, okay, Lapp. L is a fine letter, you know, in its way, but I mean, come on. O is... This is actually going on inside us.
Yeah, that's interesting.
It's amazing that any rationality occurs on the face of the earth at all.
Yeah.
That is, you know, theologians call it God's common grace. And we can really be thankful for God's common grace that just keeps us rational and sane if we have any good judgment going on at all. Something crazy inside us is being graciously overruled by God. He's really helping us. God is in good business decisions big time, but he's sort of hidden in mercy and giving us a lot of dignity. Success is a wonderfully dignifying experience. It's a mercy of God.
So when it comes to fear of man,
I'm sorry, the title was, I just thought of the title, Kent.
Yes.
A Mind of Its Own.
A Mind of Its Own. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Sorry.
Okay, good.
There's a chapter in there called The Vain Brain.
Okay, got it. A Mind of Its Own. Yeah, I'll check that out. That's interesting. I've not heard that about that research at all yet. So are there triggers for you that sort of alarms that go off if you ever deal with this, where it's, hey, what I'm dealing with here now, how I'm thinking about this now is born out of a fear of man, not out of a desire for healthy counsel?
Yes. Yeah. Self-interest is the making it about me. Trying to sort of maneuver the situation, maneuver the conversation, the email exchange, whatever it might be, in a way that is self-advantageous. Pride and fear are interwoven profoundly. I don't think those are two separate psychologies or motives. Pride is the confident part of it. Fear is the terrorized part of it. But it's all about me. And I sense that in myself. I mean, that's a trigger. I know, okay, I'm losing my way here. And deliberately decide, no, who is this really about? Let's make it about this other person. Let's make it a team win.
Yes. Changing subjects a little bit, but I wanted to be sure to ask you about how you go about structuring your communication. If you have, say in a case where you're going to be doing a speaking event or doing some teaching or maybe even preaching, I guess so, particularly like vocal communication as opposed to writing and other. But I'm curious if you have habits or roles, or even if they're subconscious, because I don't say this lightly, but I experience you as a really gifted oral communicator, and I've seen you put thought and deliberateness into talks where some people may just choose to wing it. And so I would love, and here's the other reason. I'm asking this question for two reasons.
Okay.
One is selfishly, I would like to improve my communication. And the other is, this actually came up from business people in, the question was like, what are you looking to improve? And communication was one of the top things, which was interesting.
Yeah.
And I was pleased to see it, but it makes sense because these people are in meetings and they're sending a lot of emails and all of this. And sometimes you want to sort of communicate, in the case of a memo or whatever that is, communicate something. So I was surprised to see communication pop up as such a common thing that business people wanted to get better in. And I would like to learn for myself. So I would love to hear you talk about how you go about structuring and ordering your communication.
There's a passage in the New Testament that kind of rocked my world in this area. 1 Corinthians 2, 1 through 5. Paul is talking about communication. He's talking about oral communication in particular. And he is saying the gospel itself kind of redirects his communication style. And he says in that passage, I was with you there in Corinth in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. He was not, when he was on stage, he was not a glittering personality. He didn't have a lot of pizzazz. I mean, there were schools of rhetoric in the ancient world where you could pay a fee and go, as it were, and professionalize your communication.
Yes. Isn't that how Augustine became a believer?
Yeah. And in airline magazines to this day, you can, I guess, sign up for courses with online and so forth,
Yes.
where you can learn the tricks of the trade to wow an audience and get them on their feet with a standing ovation. You can do it. There are ways to do it. And for a certain amount of money, there will be people who will show you how it's done. And in that passage, Paul he has that whole world in mind. It was real in the ancient world. It is real in the modern world. And he's turning away from it. Because what's going on is the falsification of the human being and of the message. The rhetorician of the ancient world and of today, they don't call themselves that today, but the rhetorician looks at the audience and says, how can I manipulate them to get them from point A to point B where I want to take them?
Yes.
And so I'm going to wow them with my flash and my pizzazz and my self-display. They're going to be amazed, and by the sheer force of my personality and my brilliance, I'm going to move them over here. Paul says, Paul just wouldn't stoop to it because his whole message was the cross.
Yes.
Which was not pizzazz and flash and self-display. It was humility. So what mattered most to him was the message. And he announced the message to all kinds of people, deeply desiring to persuade them. But even as he was announcing the message, he was trusting in God to be persuasive in it, even if he was an ordinary man. So what I'm trying to say is that passage has disciplined the way I think about communicating and has moderated that impulse that I feel to be impressive. And has said, no, what matters here is not you and how you are perceived. What matters is the message and how it is heard. So it's an appeal to honesty and transparency and even vulnerability. And we all know that's really very deeply wise. But that's also the communication God will bless.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a very good word. I had not thought of that passage being specifically on communication in that way. And I was sort of thinking in terms of like the flashy tips and tricks of giving a really great TED Talk as being something that is new to our day, but you're totally right. They had that back then too.
Yeah, they did.
So sort of step one would be to make sure that the communication is not self-serving and can communicate the message you would want to serve, and it's being done in a humble, transparent, even vulnerable way. It's almost like you're sacrificing yourself for the sake of the people or the message in some small way.
Well, if the real purpose energizing me is that I will wow these people.
Mm-hmm.
They will walk away from this experience thinking, that man is amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, then I've really lost my way. That is not the point. Even in business, it's helping people,
Mm-hmm.
not impressing people. That is the point.
Yes.
And that will succeed.
Yes.
God will bless it.
Yes.
But we all have this desire. Basically, Kent, here's what's wrong with the world. They just don't appreciate how wonderful I really am.
Yeah.
And I really need to help them see that.
Mm.
We all feel that way.
Yeah. Yeah, that is true. Okay, so if your communication is set up to help people, I know that you try to remove all barriers then so that you can help them the best way possible. And it seems to me that you have grown in this area. Well, I can't say that you have because I didn't know you when you were my age. But you're really good at removing barriers to communication now. So maybe that's always been that way, or maybe you've grown in that way. How have you been, where have you seen evidences of grace in being able to remove barriers to the communication? Mm-hmm. So what I see is that you seem to have a surety on what you want to say. I also see using pauses. Maybe it's just natural or maybe it's intentional, but use pauses to make a point land. And I see a lot of things that are really effective. So how much of that is just...
Kent,
I'm coming back to your tips and tricks here. Once we know that we're humble, how do you do it right?
The truth is, Kent, failure has been a very helpful teacher. Mm. Learning what doesn't work and being disillusioned with what I had confidence in is very instructive. Where would we be without the gift of failure? So that's an honest answer, Kent. Mm-hmm. Just finding out what doesn't work. Mm-hmm. It's really helped me.
Yes. Let me ask this, because I mentioned it earlier. I see you scripting your thoughts quite a lot. When will you script your communication, even if it's in a meeting, not just over the pulpit, but when will you feel like this is worthwhile to write out almost word for word?
Yeah. I do that a lot because I see it as a way of respecting the people, respecting their time, the commitment they made to come. I'm not there to waste their time. I want to get to the point and say what must be said, because I don't want them sitting there thinking, why did I come? Or when is this going to be over? Mm-hmm. That doesn't build community. It doesn't build trust. It doesn't show respect for them. I want them sitting there thinking, or at least feeling, it appears that I matter to him. He respects the moment and what is appropriate here and what will be helpful here. And if I can be consistent in doing that, then I build a relationship with the people. Then we can really accomplish something.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Anything else come to mind that maybe you use subconsciously or just out of habit that could be helpful for novices that are looking to improve their vocal communication?
Actually, there is a TED Talk that has helped me greatly by Simon Sinek. It's about how great leaders motivate people. It's 18 minutes, really worth looking at. And he explains that he has 3 circles, kind of like a target. And the outward circle is what? What's going on? What's the product? What's the event? And so forth. The next circle inside is how. How you can get involved. How you can find out more on the website. How you can make the purchase, whatever. And then the inner circle is why. Why does it even matter? Why should anybody care? And it's astonishing to me when I it seems obvious, doesn't it?
Mm.
But the why question is often assumed and not addressed.
Mm.
It should be the very first thing that a business leader, a pastor, a political leader, anyone talks about. Why do we even care? What is it that we believe together that moves us and inspires us and drives us? And if we share that belief, then here's something that can help us, and here's how you can get involved.
Yes.
That's a different way of communicating.
Mm-hmm.
And that actually honors the human being and the deepest questions of the human heart.
Mm-hmm.
What I care about and how I can go about pursuing that which I value and revere.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, that is helpful. And that falls in line with one thing. I've seen you structure communication in this way, often not necessarily over the pulpit, but when you're communicating, say, an event. Here's what we're going to do. Here's who it's going to help. And here's why they may be interested. So it kind of falls in line exactly with what you're saying there. Good. Well, I wanted to ask about Ecclesiastes, and this obviously could take we could spend the entire podcast on this, because the question is sort of broad, and the question is, what is Ecclesiastes telling us? Which, it's a very broad question, but I want to, well, maybe we could even like hone in a little bit on asking who Ecclesiastes was written for. What is it saying? And maybe what are some of the common misperceptions? But the common misperceptions, I'd love to hit on that. And here's why I'm asking this, because you preached on Ecclesiastes, I want to say in the last year. Was it in 2019 for sure?
It was about a year ago.
Okay. And I was completely misreading Ecclesiastes. And you preached 3 sermons, and it was really, really great. Maybe that's because I'm sort of the target demographic for who Ecclesiastes is written for. I don't know. But the sermon series was really, really great. And then I had someone on the podcast, and he brought up Ecclesiastes. It was Aaron Dorn. It was one of our first episodes. And then we had a listener who heard Aaron talking about the Ecclesiastes. And when Aaron and I were chatting, I mentioned that you preached on it. And that listener went and listened to those 3 sermons, and it really helped him. For whatever reason, it seems like the demographic with the podcast is resonating with the message of Ecclesiastes.
Oh, that's interesting. Huh.
So I wanted to bring it up here. I know we can't do true justice for it, but I would love to hear a little bit more about Ecclesiastes.
Ecclesiastes is often misunderstood because some people see it as a burned out, cynical old man kind of spitting at life on his way out and fed up, and this is his parting shot. That is not the case. In fact, some of our English translations, I think, actually make it harder to understand Ecclesiastes because the key phrase in the entire book, and it shows up from cover to cover in the book, is the old King James Version translates it vanity of vanities. That is, there is a certain, in some ways, many aspects of life are vain, futile. They just don't last. They will let you down. And that is part of the message of Ecclesiastes. But one of our translations actually says meaningless. But Ecclesiastes is not saying life is meaningless. It ends up by saying, we're going to die, we're going to stand before the Lord to give an account for how we live. That's very meaningful. Mm-hmm. So here's the point. The message of Ecclesiastes is a both and, not an either or. The message of Ecclesiastes is both life is broken, accept that, and life is good, enjoy that. Now, we tend to think, no, wait a minute, it's got to be one or the other. Mm-hmm. If you want to talk to me about how broken life is, how short life is, how disappointing life is, it just slips through our fingers, and fades away like a vapor and it's over forever. Okay, let's talk about that. And there's a lot of poetry written about that. There's great movies about that, a lot of music about that, and so forth. But Ecclesiastes also insists that common everyday life is a gracious gift from God, and he commands us to enjoy it. So I couldn't be a Christian if Ecclesiastes were not in the Bible. This is such an honest book. It is a wholesome book. It is psychologically helpful. It is a positive, life-affirming book, even while utterly realistic. And it talks about the pain of life, the disappointment of life, the shortness of life, and says you got to face that. Don't build a life of illusion. But at the same time, God is touching you every day in the simple things of every day. So taking a walk, holding hand for your wife, that's actually amazing. That shouldn't happen in a world like this. That there's such a thing as a neighborhood with sidewalks. I have a wife in this amazing relationship called marriage. She has this precious hand I just love to hold. It's the end of the day, about dusk. We've had dinner. We go out and take a walk. We watch the sun go down. That's amazing. None of that should be happening. That is a huge kiss on the cheek from God above. And for us to scorn that or belittle that is really disrespectful toward God. Instead, the best way to respond to God in those endless moments of life is to rejoice and give thanks.
You mentioned looking down on the little things in life like that and sort of scorning that. I'm going to walk in the light a little bit here, because there was a season in life, and I actually still feel like I struggle with that a little bit, where I sort of think those little things are petty and I must be a little oversimple to enjoy them.
Yeah.
Is that a human nature thing, or is that partly what Ecclesiastes is instructing us?
Exactly.
You may be tempted to think you're too sophisticated or too busy for the little things, but no, slow down, enjoy them. They're from God.
That's exactly right, because God is not too busy. God is not above the little things. God is present in the little things. So it talks about enjoying life with the wife whom you love during this short life. It talks about go eat your bread with joy. Let your wear your white garments. In other words, your party clothes. Eat your bread, drink your joy, drink your wine, and so forth. It doesn't invite us to go to a feast, because not everybody can afford that. But everybody can experience human life. And that's where God is present. There's nothing wrong with a feast.
Yes.
But you're not missing out on the best things in life if you can't afford that.
Yes.
The best things in life are right here, right now.
No, that's interesting. That's very interesting, because that levels the playing field, and that gives us less reason to look up, to idolize celebrities and rich people, because we have access to the best things alongside them.
That's right.
Yeah, that is. Who was it written for, Ecclesiastes? Do we know?
Yes, we do. Because it says in chapter 11, rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and so forth. So Ecclesiastes was written by an older man who had really seen a lot of life for a younger man, maybe 18, 20, 22, is more starting out in life. And it's the older man coaching the younger man in wisdom, in how to build a both and complete view of human life, not to be deceived by false promises, and not to miss out on the good but sometimes sort of hidden blessings of God.
Yes. When you preach the sermons, I wrote in my Bible at the beginning of Ecclesiastes, you mentioned that there are 3 categories that we can find ourselves in. One is shallow optimism. 2 is bitter cynicism, and 3, simple wisdom.
Yeah.
And Ecclesiastes is trying to instruct us in the simple wisdom.
Yeah.
And I just thought of this. Did you say in those sermons or somewhere else that you would not be married to Janie if it wasn't for Ecclesiastes?
I did say that, yes, because it was the spring of 1969. I was a sophomore at Wheaton College. I was absolutely spellbound by this amazing girl I'd met. But I was not the only one who noticed her. So I was facing stiff competition. Yeah. And actually I was wondering, should I just give up? Because maybe I'm not in her league. So I went back to my dorm room and I said, I need God's help with this. And I don't recommend this, okay? But God was just merciful to me. I said, okay, I'm going to start reading the Bible and I'm going to find the answer. So I was reading Ecclesiastes. I came to chapter 11, and it said, "Rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and follow the sight of your eyes and the ways of your heart. But know that God will bring you into judgment for these things." Now, I know that that's not saying, go enjoy yourself and then God will body slam you. Mm-hmm. That would be totally cynical. Because the judgment that chapter 11 refers to, he returns to in chapter 12 saying, God will bring everything into judgment, whether good or evil. Mm. So judgment simply reveals whether we have lived in this life with wisdom and integrity or not. And so anyway, I read that verse and I said, okay, there's my answer from God. I mean, I am spellbound by this amazing girl, and God is saying, you like her? Well, go ask her out.
How soon after that did you?
Very quickly.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And I took her out to a nice restaurant in the Chicago area, and I asked her to go study with me. And to my amazement, she said yes.
Oh, really? Okay,
yeah.
First time?
No. I dated her a few times, but
okay.
I was kind of in danger of losing heart.
Okay.
So I put the pedal to the metal.
Good choice. Actually, that's a great segue into this next one. I wanted to ask you about if you have advice to a young husband who feels like he is underwater because he has various responsibilities and he's having a hard time keeping up with all these different responsibilities. Mm-hmm. And on top of all those sort of feelings of shortcomings or just longing to do a better job in those various responsibilities, his wife came into the marriage relationship thinking that it would be good to have a sit down every single day with the two of them and read the Bible and pray together. And this is what happened to me. Mm-hmm. And I was talking to someone just recently, and he's going through that now. Okay. And this was actually the biggest challenge in Marianne and I's marriage in the first 2 years. Being married was wonderful. It was better than I expected.
Yes.
And we didn't really fight, and we didn't have, I guess, a lot of the marriage challenges that we were warned about. But this one was a challenge, and it actually rocked me pretty hard. So what is your advice or counsel for a young husband in that situation? He feels like he's not leading his wife well spiritually.
I think the first thing I'd say is if he feels overwhelmed and inadequate, I would say, oh, that's so good. It's not pleasant, but it's so good. What if you felt as though you were really on top of it? What if you were looking at yourself thinking, I've got this. I am really good at this. That would not be encouraging. So much of life, this life is exhaustion, depletion, frustration, inadequacy is a pervasive reality in this life. Let's accept it. Let's make peace with that. We are very rarely going to feel anything else. So that feeling is not necessarily a true indicator of how we're doing. It's just what we're stuck with for now. And we have to evaluate and assess how we're doing by more objective criteria. And always remember that feeling of being overwhelmed and inadequate is a gift from above. It's just a reminder from God, I am here. The reason we feel inadequate is that we are. That's not a neurosis. We're connecting with reality. And God is in that, inviting us to welcome him into our inadequacy with grace all sufficient, moment by moment. So the first thing to say is, congratulations, you're a member of the human race. And the other thing is, I think to realize the word season is overused, but I can't think of a better word right now. That season in life between the early days of marriage, young kids, until they leave for college and so forth. That time in life has a very definite beginning. It has a very definite ending. And at any given moment of frustration, you're just somewhere between those 2 points of time. Hey, why not enjoy it? Mm-hmm. Those years of 24/7 mega commitment with when our kids were young, oh, Ken, I miss those years so much. Oh, I wish I could go back. They were just glorious years. And now our kids are in that very place with their own kids, and I kind of envy them. So having kids, being in that place in life with so much calling for your attention, so many needs, so many demands, what a wonderful privilege. God has located you where you are needed. You're making a difference. You're important to that young wife. You're important to those kids. And in a way that nobody else on the face of the earth can be important. That is a privilege. Why not enjoy it? Your children are not a death sentence, except to your selfishness and mine. Your children are a gift with all their needs. And this is the one time in life when God is giving you the opportunity to invest in them, shape them, guide them, correct them, affirm them, and all the things that are needed. So, is it easy? No. Is it glorious? Yes. Let's not miss the glory just because it's hard.
Yes.
And there will be time enough after the last one goes off to college and you break out the champagne. I mean, we love our kids, but enough is enough. Yeah. So
there's a reason they're supposed to get older and leave the house.
That's right. So, and you go back to being empty nesters, and it's like you sort of relive those early years, except you're better at it now. And there will be time enough then for, travel, recreation, and other pursuits that you kind of had to say no to for those years. Those aren't going away. They'll come back. Don't worry about it. Don't freak out. You're right where God wants you.
Yeah. And one thing I've thought of too is if you don't make it into those years, if you die before then, we're not missing. We have the new earth, right? It's not like we've got to go fully experience this life right now. And if we don't, we've missed it for eternity.
Oh, that's right.
Because I did used to think that way a little bit. But if it's the new earth and new heavens, then we can start to enjoy the earth now. But it's not like we have this constrained amount of time to go out and enjoy it fully because we're going to have plenty of time. Is that a correct way of thinking about it?
I really think it is. And it enables us to say, one of Jani's favorite verses is from the Apostle Paul, I will most gladly spend and be spent for your souls.
Okay, so is there a right or a wrong answer on what it should look like in the daily rule of life for a husband and wife who are seeking to serve the Lord, and what that should look like in their daily habits, devotional or otherwise?
Yeah. I really think that goes in the category of Philippians chapter 2, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling.
Okay.
I really like the attitude of the Apostle Paul there. When Moses, under the old covenant, was coming to the end of his life, he said, you people, you've been a headache, my entire time with you, and after I die, it's going to get worse. The Apostle Paul, living under the new covenant, says, it's been a privilege to know you, but y'all don't need me. God is at work in you. You're going to be fine. Work out your own salvation.
Mm-hmm.
Very confident.
Yes.
So he is saying to us, he's saying to Janie and me, saying to you and Mariana, go figure it out. Go figure out what works best for you.
Mm.
And there's not a false ideal that you have to live up to that's alien to you, external to you. Go find out under the Lord, confident that he's in work in your hearts. Go figure out what satisfies the two of you. And that'll be God's answer for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's very helpful. I appreciate that. Okay, let's see where we want to go from here. I don't think we're going to be able to get to all of it, like I warned you. So, I wanted to know, I didn't know exactly how to put this. So, the question may sound a little odd, but I wanted to ask what you feel or are feeling at this stage in your life. 69 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Turning 70 September of 2020.
2019.
Yeah. I thought we were in 2019 for a second. September of 2019. You're going to be moving on as lead pastor of Emmanuel Nashville, September of next year. This is, do I have this correctly? This would be the first time you are not a pastor since 1975?
Yes.
It's 2018. Okay,
Gasp.
so that's happening.
Yeah.
Your kids are all grown, and it seems to me like you and Janie have done a wonderful job as parents. What does it feel like to be where you are, looking back on all of your experiences?
Yeah. Wow. Thank you. That's a very personal question. It's several things. One, every generation says this afresh, and the rising generation never believes it, so they have to rediscover it for themselves. Life is a vapor. It passes by so quickly. I met Janie 50 years ago this fall, right now. It feels like 2 weeks. 50 years sounds to me like a long time, but I've experienced it as a very short time. So that is landing on me with dramatic impact, the shortness of life. It's not a negative thing. It's just astonishing to me. This is really happening to me, real time, in existential reality. The other thing is, the other primary thing, Kent, is maybe this sounds crazy. I feel loved by God. I've not always felt that way. A few years ago, I went through a very difficult experience where, for the first time in my life, I felt honesty demanded me to rethink that question. Because I looked at my life and I thought, maybe the truth is God hates my guts. I mean, look at this. Look at this wreckage. And I was wrong. The truth is, God loves me. I feel loved by God. And the striking thing to me, Kent, is that I didn't leverage my way from where I was in that deep place, that dark place, to where I am now. I didn't reason my way there. I didn't muscle my way there. I don't know how I got here, except that God loves me. So I view I feel attended to by God. I feel cared for by God. And I feel that there's a kind of reverent mystery that surrounds that to me in my own perception. So I wish I could be more helpful to you and those who are sharing this time with us. But ultimately, isn't it true? When God, Almighty God in heaven above, is dealing with us, we don't finally understand that. We just receive it and thank Him for it. So the other primary, not only is life so fleeting, but also God is so good.
Mm-hmm.
And he has faithfully cared for me. All the old sayings, like the old Christian hymn, "Great is thy faithfulness." That is real.
Mm-hmm.
There's a reason why people have been singing that song for generations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let me ask about the life is a vapor. Because as a 34-year-old, I hear that and I believe it, and then I forget it very easily. And here you are at your vantage point, almost 70. Would you have counsel for us younger people born out of that knowledge that, yeah, life is truly a vapor, and you see that more clearly now than even you did when you were 34 years old? And how would that instruct a 34-year-old?
Yeah. Well, it really takes us back to the book of Ecclesiastes. And to put it in our categories, don't put all your chips on the square of what won't last. Now, God is present in all aspects of our lives in this world, none of which will last. So I mean, here we are in this lovely home that I so enjoy. I love living in this home. It's not going to last. That doesn't mean I stop enjoying it, but it does mean I don't assign it in my psychology and in my hopes and in my emotions a kind of ultimate status such that I have to hang on to it. God gave it to me. God's going to take it away, and that's fine. In the meantime, I'm just going to enjoy it as from his hand.
When it comes to this house, this is a great example. There is a school of thought, I think, where at some point the end of time comes, earth burns up, goes away, we all sort of go off to heaven. And then there's another, then Scripture talks about the new earth.
Yes.
And this is getting a little off topic here, but I'm just curious because it's something that I've been thinking about. What will stay? What's going to happen, Ray? Tell us what's going to happen. I mean, what stays and what does not make it into the new earth?
2 Peter talks about fires, consuming the world and the creation. But I think those are purifying fires, not destroying fires. Because the Bible begins, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the Bible ends, in the end, God will recreate and renew and rejuvenate the heavens and the earth. There is a Dutch theologian, a very fine theologian, named Herman Bavinck, and wrote significant, profound theology. And there are those who have sort of summarized his thought with 3 simple words: grace redeeming nature. Grace doesn't eradicate nature. God's grace redeems God's creation. So that when we go to heaven, it's not going to be massed choirs up in these fluffy clouds because the earth has been burned away to a crisp by these eschatological fires. Instead, the eternal state we're going to live in, we're going to walk into it and we're going to look around and say, wow, this looks familiar, but this is perfect. So Revelation 21, man, I love this. It says, the kings of the earth, that is the culture shapers and culture leaders, will bring the glory and honor of the nations into the holy city, the heavenly city, the New Jerusalem. So some years ago, Janie and I were in Beijing. We had dinner one night in what had been the home of a Chinese prince 300 years ago.
Oh, wow.
It was amazing, a beautiful place, traditional Chinese food, traditional Chinese music, traditional Chinese dress, and there was so much about it I didn't understand. But I was sitting there thinking, communism has not, it doesn't even have the power to destroy the glories of traditional Chinese culture.
Mm.
Food, music, dance, dress, everything. Because the glory and honor of the nations, including 17th century China, will be brought into the new Jerusalem, where these we've been culture makers all along. God made us culture makers.
Mm-hmm.
So these glories of human making are meant to last forever. God is not going to delete them. God is going to perfect them. So when we were in that restaurant in Beijing, that was a preview of coming attractions.
Mm.
We were seeing something of heaven
Mm-hmm.
on earth. And that's true of me as a kid growing up in California, with surfing and the Beach Boys and garage bands and that goofy teenagerish world I grew up in. That was of God.
Mm.
And it was glorious. Very imperfect, very flawed, but God is not going to trash it.
Mm-hmm.
God's going to perfect it.
Mm-hmm.
And the English language, for example, is going to be spoken forever.
Mm.
The Southern accent is going to last forever. The English accent is going to last forever. But it's just going to be perfect.
Mm.
What we'd always tried to reach for and never could quite capture.
Yeah.
It's going to be very satisfying.
Yeah. Yeah, we have a lot to look forward to.
Yeah.
I want to ask about the succession that you are having. So you founded Emmanuel Nashville over 10 years ago,
Yeah.
10 and a half years ago or so.
Mm-hmm.
And next year you'll sort of retire from that role as lead pastor. And it seems, based on my experience of that, the process is going very well. So are there particular keys or mile markers that you would say should be considered in a succession, whether that's pastoral or otherwise?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm really grateful to you and the other leaders in the church for helping us shape a process that would really satisfy the people and create decisions that could be believed in and that could really settle on that community. A couple of keys, I think: giving the whole process time and patience, not rushing anything, not inadvertently creating unnecessary crisis and drama. Secondly, open communication with lots of honesty. Both happiness about what's going well and open recognition of what's going to be difficult. When people know their leaders are telling them the truth and leveling with them, not in a demoralizing way, but just they know, okay, I don't have to wonder what's really going on. That's really encouraging to people. Thirdly, in the process, participation by everyone who has a legitimate stake in it. Everyone deserves the opportunity to process it, speak into it, share in it, participate in it. And no one should have to feel, who has a legitimate stake in it, no one should have to feel, I didn't get my chance to enter in or make a contribution. I was somehow blocked. That would really be disruptive. And finally, it's just, I realize how crucial it is as the leader who is stepping out, that does not end my responsibility in this community. It means I transition to a new responsibility, which is I will be the head cheerleader for the new leader. And I have to be very careful never to say anything or even to appear in any way to be less than enthusiastic about the new leader. I owe that to him. And it will help the people.
Yes.
And it'll be my final success.
Yes, because it bodes well for you if the succession goes well and the new leader is implemented properly and Yeah, I really agree with that. Thanks for sharing on that. I wanted to ask you about gospel culture. This is another topic that we could spend the entire podcast talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But you wrote a book on gospel culture and how there's gospel doctrine and gospel culture. Could you share just a little bit about gospel culture? And do you have thoughts on how, I know that you've written a book on how that can look in the church.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to hear any thoughts, if you have it, on how that could potentially look in a business setting.
I wish I could say I've thought that through more thoroughly than I have. I would love you need to write that book, Kent. What a healthy, beautiful, humane culture can become in a business setting because the gospel is making a difference there. But gospel doctrine is simply the good news that God loves and cares for the undeserving for the sake of Jesus. And gospel culture is when the surprise of that and the grace of that, the mercy of that, the beauty of that, that grace coming down vertically from God starts to bleed out into our relationships with one another. Mm-hmm. And the whole world is calculated to treat people as they deserve. That's the logic that pervades human relationships in the world. And we calibrate one another and sort of assess and even judge one another in terms of what you deserve. Of course, I'm quite aware of the good things I deserve, but I'm also aware of the bad things you deserve. That is not, the gospel transforms that. The gospel gets us treating people better than they deserve because God has treated me better than I deserve. Mm-hmm. And when the beauty of that grace lands on a community and people know that they are not going to be undermined, still there's accountability built in. There are assessments and so forth. Excuse me 1 second. When people can relax and know that they're not going to be undermined, that there are expectations and there are goals to meet. But those are fair goals. And the supports are there to help people get to those goals. The encouragements are there. And then when they reach those goals, there's reward and there's happiness and there's high-fiving and so forth. And when people find that they're being treated better than they know they deserve, and that happens repeatedly as a new pattern, not just as an anomalous one-time event, but a whole pattern, that's a gospel culture. I would love to read a book that you write about that very thing.
I know. I don't think I'm the one to write that book, to be honest with you. It would be interesting to. I mean, I think that I have not put a lot of thought into this, but I think a lot of what is in that book on gospel culture in a church setting probably works in a business setting.
Another way to describe it is a for you social environment. That's very reproducible in a company.
Yeah. The idea of a gospel culture is prevalent at church, and I know a lot of people really appreciate that. And so there does need to be something on that in the business setting. So after you're not lead pastor at Emmanuel anymore and look for things to do, there you can put that on the list. I also wanted to ask you this. Last year, we were reading the book Knowing God by J.I. Packer, and that was a real privilege for me to read that through with you. Thank you again for doing that. And I was pretty sure in that book, I leafed through it again this morning trying to find it, and I couldn't find it. I had a lot written and marked up and underlined, but I couldn't find it. But I was pretty sure in that book somewhere, J.I. Packer talked about balance, and and I thought that he said he feels like it's a weak word.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that we talked about this briefly, but this also is something that comes up a fair bit with the people that I'm talking to with their responsibilities in business, is this idea of work-life balance, and how that can sort of seem. And then it seemed more recently that, okay, so it seems like the work-life balance used to be, that was the common knowledge, like that you could find balance. But then in more recent years, it seems to be more common that, oh, I don't know if that's actually going to work. We've been trying that a while. We still don't have balance. How would you instruct us to think about balance in life? Is that the right way to think about it? Is there another way to think about it? Can you help us there?
Yeah, Packer does talk about balance as a weak concept, and perhaps I think he calls it a awkwardly self-conscious concept. It's not liberating. I think the category balance as the way we're going to assemble our lives holds us back. I don't think balance creates greatness. And the world needs greatness of nobility, greatness of sacrifice. How is anybody going to sacrifice for the greater good when balance is the criterion by which they're making their decisions? Nobody. If I'm living a well-balanced life, I don't know where sacrifice fits in. So I would rather think in terms not balance, but focus, priorities, and convictions. And that means, for example, my family is not something I'm balancing and including. My family is to me, is a matter of conviction. That dignifies my family. That means that when I'm paying attention to my family, I'm not really thinking about my business and I'm paying attention to you now so I can get back to that because this is part of my balance. My family is a part of my conviction, network of convictions that define who I am and drive me. I think we're going to go a lot further in life if we let go of the idea of balance. Instead, think in terms of purpose, focus, convictions, priorities. There's real traction and energy in those categories.
Yes. Yeah, you're right about that. And then is it safe to assume that as you take action on convictions and priorities, that sometimes your life may feel out of balance? Is that fair?
The reality is our lives are like a continual experience of river rafting. It's just a wild ride, and we never know what's around the corner. How do you put balance? How do you bring balance into one of those crazy rafts as it's, being driven by the waves? Why would we even want to live a life of balance? It sounds boring. It doesn't sound inspiring. Winston Churchill, I'm reading a biography of his right now, a very, very interesting by Gilbert. I can't see he was a man of balance because he was a man of risk. I did not know this. He was actually under gunfire about 50 times in his life. Never actually took a bullet, but he stuck his neck out in India, in the Boer War down in South Africa and elsewhere, and came under gunfire about 50 times. How do you include that in the balanced mix of your life?
Yeah. It's not a healthy It's not a healthy input.
No. What you do is you realize there are things in life that are worth risking for.
Yeah.
And those are the great things.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. It lends emphasis to conviction and priority, which is good. And then it also takes the guilt and some of the pressure off a little bit, because it does seem like no one has ever really figured out how to really balance their life. And so there's that pressure there of trying to get to that utopia and we're just not going to.
No.
Okay, second to last question. I know you like books. You read a lot. So for our audience, just in general, I mean, is there books that this is a big question, I know, but is there books that just come to mind? Man, someone in the Christian faith, it doesn't matter really if they're in business or not, but just in general, hey, here's some books you just gotta check out. Because actually, I gotta have to admit this. Knowing God by J.I. Packer was not on my radar until you brought it up. I don't know how I missed that book. I mean, that to me is, if I were to have a list, that book would just be like, at some point you got to read that book. You know, Is there other books that come to mind?
Boy, that's a great place to start, Kent, because Knowing God by J.I. Packer, that phrase comes from the book of Daniel, where it says, "The people who know their God will take action." People who know who God is know a lot better how to live life. So, Knowing God by J.I. Packer, great place to start. Also, another great one is Desiring God by John Piper, which was for me sort of paradigm shifting, because it really is a whole new approach to the totality of life, with God at the center, but not God as a dreary obligation, but God as a satisfying desire, which is very biblical, but sort of startling to so many of us who kind of grew up merely religious people. And you sort of, tip your hat to God every Sunday and then get on with life. This Desiring God by John Piper obliterates that sort of dreary, boring, contemptible, nominal, semi-Christian outlook and replaces it with a compelling and glorious God-centered approach to the whole of life. Then I would say anything by C.S. Lewis. For example, the Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. He gives us insights into how the devil thinks and how evil inverts how evil can invert one's perception of everything. So it's worth knowing how the opposition thinks. But anything by C.S. Lewis is so insightful and yet fun to read. It's not tedious. And then I would also say biographies of significant people. This biography of Churchill that I'm reading right now is startling and instructive, and every page is it whispers to me, you matter too. Don't trivialize yourself. I believe, Kent, every one of us, Churchill just makes it obvious, wonderfully obvious, every one of us has been put into history, into this place at this time, by a divine purpose. We are so not wasting our time. Our lives matter, and here was a man who, even with, in my opinion, an inadequate view of God, nevertheless, he had a sense of destiny. Kent, every person on the face of the earth deserves and has every right to have a sense of destiny. It's only in Christ that we find it. But everybody matters. And biographies help us to realize the impact we can have.
Thank you. Is there anything that comes to mind as far as just closing advice to our listeners?
Life is either a cynical and cruel joke or an unimaginably glorious privilege. And every one of us has to decide what we really, really think about that. And what God is saying to us is that when we look at Jesus, he is God's best clue as to what our lives are really about and what they're really worth.
Mm.
So stare at him for a good long time.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're very
Thanks for
welcome.
being on the podcast. This is quite an honor.
Oh, it's my privilege. It's just been great to be with you, Ken. I
Yeah.
really respect you. Really respect the work you're doing.
Yeah, well, the feeling is definitely mutual. Thank you again.
Okay.